Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Jardine and I'm part of the A Rocha team here in Melbourne. And as part of Activate 2020, I'm having a series of conversations around creation care and mission and hearing some stories of creation care in the field. And today I'm joined by Tony Rinaudo from World Vision. And Tony is known across the world as the forest maker for his work in transforming desert landscapes to green, productive fields. And he's been awarded a member of the Order of Australia for his work over 4 decades across Africa and Asia. So I'm very interested to hear his story. And in particular, something about God's work in his life and God's work through his life's work. So Tony, why don't you introduce yourself and just take your time and tell us something about your work.
Okay, Julia, thank you for the opportunity to share. Currently I'm the Climate Change Action Advisor at World Vision. I've been at World Vision now 20 years and it's been quite a long journey. I'd have to say that it started in childhood. And I grew up in beautiful northeast Victoria, and I loved the bush. I loved God's creation. We'd go fishing, we'd go swimming in the Ovens River. But there were a few things that were happening that really upset me, and I think God used those things to shape the trajectory of my life. And so at that time, tobacco was the main crop in our valley. And they were using heavy insecticides. They're actually spraying them from planes. So DDT was drifting into the rivers that we swam in and drank from. And every now and then there'd be big trout floating down belly up. They were clearing the bush on the hills. And even without the education background, I knew enough that it just didn't make sense that the biodiversity was destroyed. Steep land was left bare, and there was erosion, higher temperatures, and so on. And I wondered about the adult world and what their values were. I'm not against progress. I know you have to make a living, but the way we were going about the business of making a living was very, very destructive. At the same time, I was a reasonable reader, and I'd watch the news, and it disturbed me very much that children, just like me, who, through no fault of their own, they happened to be born elsewhere, were growing up hungry. And just the injustice of it, and the foolishness too, that we could grow tobacco, something that you destroy the environment, you destroy people's health. We use good resources, good soil and water to grow that, while innocent children were going hungry. And I think as a child I was very frustrated, very angry. But I did the one thing that I could do, and I just said a simple child's prayer, asking God, please use me somehow, somewhere to make a difference. Mm-hmm. My life story, my life journey, I think has been an attempt to be true to that prayer. I went on to study agriculture. I love growing things, and I thought, well, you've got to be useful. I studied agriculture at University of New England in Armidale. That's where I met my wife, Liz, who had a similar sense of calling. But even though I was heading in the right direction, you'd get discouraged from time to time, and you'd wonder, well, who do you think you are? What difference do you think you can make? And it's amazing how God stepped in at those key points when I needed encouragement and redirection sort of thing. And a verse came to my attention, Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, to do good works, which he prepared beforehand. And to me, that was just music. I didn't know what I would do. I didn't know where or how, but it didn't matter anymore because God knew. And I could leave it in his hands and just keep following step by step as God revealed the next step. And so that gave me a lot of encouragement to go on. We were married at the end of university, and we studied at Bible College before we joined SIM, Serving in Mission. And we were assigned to Niger Republic, I'd made the mistake, if you like, in the application form. I said I was interested in dryland agriculture. Well, you can't get much drier than the edge of the Sahara Desert. And when I realized, actually, I'm going to have to learn the local language and I'm going to have to learn French, I pleaded. I said, oh, just send us to Nigeria. You work there. It's just across the border and they speak English. But the die was cast and we were sent to Niger. In hindsight, I can just see God's hand in that, and how working in such a desperately hopeless situation, and really everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And yet, by the grace of God, we were able to have an impact. Because of that story, what happened in Niger is an inspiration to the world. And the work that was started there is having ripple effects across Africa and beyond. So we had a basic bit of language under our belts after, I think, 2 months of study. And the person I was taking over from, Pat Frangi, he started taking me to the villages. And I distinctly remember one of these days we were sleeping over. Normally it would be a day visit and you'd come back. But this time we were sleeping over, and we were sitting around the little fireplace near the huts, talking with the village people. And it was as if I'd come out of myself, and I was looking down at the conversation, and I thought, hey, I'm really happy. I feel like I've come home. And then that verse came back to me. This is the work that God had prepared for you beforehand. Now, being in the right place and doing God's work doesn't mean it's easy. And there were lots and lots of challenges and struggles, but we really were in God's place for us. And I was managing a reforestation project that was using a conventional approach, the approach that everybody at the time was taking, because that's all we knew. We were planting trees. What appeared to be desert all around us had been a biodiverse dryland forest at the time I was growing up in Australia. And over those few decades, that had been destroyed. As population grew and people needed farmland, they needed income from the sale of wood, they destroyed that forest. And now they were living with the consequences. We didn't know about climate change back then, although in hindsight we understand now it was happening. But without the trees, the soil fertility declined, the wind speeds, there was nothing to stop the wind, and they were very, very damaging to the crops. Extremely high temperatures and so on. It exacerbated the difficult situation that they were in. But we were planting trees. If there's no trees there, then the solution is to get them back in there by all means possible. And we were planting them, and it's a terrible failure. We tried everything. I read widely. I consulted others. I experimented. But under those harsh conditions, the high temperatures, the long droughts, and the attitude of the people, they didn't want trees. They wanted food crops and cash crops, which is quite understandable. But everything that we did was a failure. And by about 2.5 years into our stay there, and I'm young, I'm enthusiastic, I want to make my mark on Africa, and it's just not happening. I was ready to give up and go home. And I remember one particularly discouraging day, and I was just feeling miserable and thinking it's a waste of time, waste of money. Why did God send me out here? And I stopped the vehicle. We had a pickup truck and a trailer full of trees. We were taking them to the villages, knowing full well that the people didn't look after them. Most of them would die, and it was useless. And you'd look out over that barren landscape, north, south, east, west, hardly a tree in sight. I'm thinking, this isn't going to make a dent, and it wouldn't matter how many $1 million, how many years, how many staff, it wasn't going to have any difference at all. But I felt, no, God had called me here. God doesn't make mistakes. And again, I prayed. I just said, Lord, forgive us. A little bit of a strange prayer. I don't feel personally responsible for the increase of the desert in West Africa, but in a sense, we're all responsible for the environmental destruction that's going on around us. So forgive us for destroying the gift of your creation. And as a consequence of that, people are suffering. They're hungry, they're poor, and really they're frightened. They don't know what to do, where their life is heading. But I reminded God, you love us. Show us what to do. Help us, open our eyes. And I had stopped to reduce the air pressure. In that very sandy soil, if you have too much pressure in the tires, you just get bogged. So I'd stopped to reduce the air pressures and I'd finished that task. And as I stood up and looked around, what seemed to be a bush caught my attention. And, you know, I'd been on this track for 2.5 years almost every week, and I'd never stopped and looked closely at these things. They were just, as far as I could see, either weeds or just desert bushes. They weren't of any significance. But it caught my attention on this day, and I went over and took a closer look. And of course, the few indigenous trees that remained in the landscape, they were very distinctive. Every tree has a signature shape to the leaf, the colour, so on. Even though it was a bush, it had the leaf shape of that species. And I said, that's not a bush, that's a tree. And it's been cut down. And every year, in preparation for farming, people slash that regrowth that's coming up from the stump. It's suckering, it's coppicing from the stump. But they cut it back in order to have a clean field for planting. But in that moment, everything changed. And I knew it wasn't a question of budget or technology or super tree, miracle tree. This was about beliefs about the environment and about trees and practices and behavior. And if I could convince people, because at the end of the day, even though we're from a different culture, we all have the same hurts and wants and hopes. If I could convince them that they would have a better future for their children and for themselves by working with nature and allowing some of these trees to regrow, then nature would heal itself. God's built it into creation to be self-healing and regenerating. It's just amazing. You know, we think it's lost. Just amazing how it'll come back if you take the constraints off it. And people were slashing and burning and grazing on it. It's no wonder it couldn't regrow. If you can convince them to change that behavior, then the rest would be easy. And so I guess that's 30 odd years ago now, I've been this campaigner, first in Niger and now globally, for what is embarrassingly simple, but amazingly effective. And in Niger alone, if you go to the literature and the Google images, there are about 6 million hectares of formerly degraded land with an average of 4 trees per hectare, today sporting around 40 trees per hectare across 6 million hectares. That's 240 million trees without planting a single one of them, but by convincing people. I call it regreening mindscapes. So I joined World Vision in 1999, and I'll stop now to let you have a question, but I've been a man on a mission. I've seen the impact, what it does to help people in their livelihoods, their food security, more significantly perhaps the restoration of hope. People now see a future and they're willing to invest and take responsible risks to improve their lives. It's just so exciting.
Yeah, and it's phenomenal what has been accomplished. And your story reminds me that the Christian calling to care for creation and Christian communities caring for the environment isn't new. You've been doing it for 4 decades. But there seems at the moment to be a renewed interest and vigour and emphasis on creation care as a vehicle for mission. What do you think has changed?
I guess a number of things have converged, and fortunately, there's a greater awareness to take a more environmentally concerned approach.
I expect that environmental issues today are much more prominent on the news, kind of like the global crises in terms of climate change and habitat loss, species loss.
It's hard to avoid it. It's in your face every day. You'd have to be very, very hardened to not be aware of it, I think.
And
a lot of people are genuinely worried, particularly the younger generation, about climate change. But when you learn about biodiversity collapse and the loss of the coral reefs and kelp forests and so on, all these things are coming together, and something has to be done.
And do you sense that there's a kind of like a reawakening amongst Christians in terms of that call to care for creation and to be representing God and living in his name in that respect?
I think so. Yeah, sadly, I think we're put to shame sometimes by non-believers that they're more vocal and doing more to save God's creation than Christians are. We should be at the forefront. And I wrote down a few verses here. Job 38:1. The angels shouted with joy when God created the earth. You know, they were having a great big party up there. How many Christians shout for joy over creation? Proverbs 8:30 and 31. Then I was beside him, and this being Jesus as wisdom. Then I was beside him like a master workman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, delighting in the sons of men. And then this one, Genesis 31, which we're more familiar with. God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. It's got intrinsic value in its own right. So there's so much reason for us to be not just excited, but if it made God so happy at the time of creation to be enjoying the created world, what does he feel like today when he sees it being dismantled and trashed? He must be so sad, and we should be sad too.
And your story is very much one of hope and restoration, and just a story of how one man, one person, can be used by God to do amazing things on a global scale. But for a lot of us, it can be quite overwhelming when we're faced with all the news about what's happening to the environment. So what encouragement can you give to us all in terms of what we can do individually in the face of the problems that we have?
Well, I think back to that child's prayers, asking God to use me somehow, somewhere, to make a difference. And in my case, he sent me to Africa. I don't think he's going to do that to everyone. And many people are actually scared to pray a prayer like that. They think you'll make me do something that I don't want. And I don't think that's God's character, actually. But don't be scared to pray for God to use you and to open your eyes to what you can do. And thinking back step by step, God revealed to me the next step. He didn't show me as a young person the suffering and hardship I would face in Niger. And that's just as well, because I probably would never have gone. But he did show me there was this ad. I'd never heard of University of New England. And when it was the right time to go to university, it just made sense to go there. And that's where I met Liz. And just step by step and being obedient and taking that step in obedience will lead to the next step. So I found myself in Niger at the right time and the right place to ignite a major restoration movement. And since that time, it's had ripples across the continent and further. And so I think we can all pray. And God wants to move mountains through us in different ways. It won't be the same for each one of us, but we can all act. We can all do something. And if it's as little as turning the light switch off when you leave the room, walking when you don't have to drive, joining a Friends of this creek or that park group, writing to a politician, we can all vote. We can all give some amount of money. There's something that we can do if we're willing to be obedient and willing to put ourselves out there saying, God, how can you use me? It's no use to anybody to feel sorry for ourselves and just crumple up in a ball and say we're doomed. That's just negative thinking. It's never helped anyone.
Well, thank you, Tony. I feel really encouraged by what I've heard. To really lay myself more open to God and say that prayer, and take a step at a time and see what God can do in our lives. So it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.